Last talk is, I think, on something very topical. You can't turn on your television every 5 minutes hearing something about AI from either Microsoft or IBM, and we're going to hear about some of its applications here in medicine. So our final speaker is Dr. Peter Higgins from the University of Michigan, who runs their IBD Center, professor of medicine, and he's going to talk to us about the state-of-the-art on dysplasia, surveillance, and IBD, and the use of artificial intelligence. Peter, thanks for being here.
Thank you very much. So I'm not going to have any videos, which is a little disappointing, but I'm going to talk about two hot topics in IBD endoscopy. One is about chromoendoscopy and our ability to detect and monitor dysplasia and prevent colon cancer, and whether that truly makes sense compared to standard surveillance. And then kind of the onset of artificial intelligence, which has come into IBD, particularly as an entry point from clinical trials and trying to consistently rate disease activity. But there are going to be a lot more applications. It's coming a lot faster than we anticipated, and I think you're going to start seeing companies wanting to sell you some version of AI to assist your endoscopy very soon. So I'm going to talk first about the first half, the pros and cons of chromoendoscopy in screening for colonic dysplasia and IBD. The pros of chromoendoscopy: it has very high sensitivity for dysplasia. Unfortunately, there's a trade-off between sensitivity and specificity that's really important to think about, and we're going to talk about that a lot. And think about the goals of IBD-CRC surveillance and the natural history of dysplasia, the changing incidence of IBD-CRC, and alternatives to chromoendoscopy. The benefits of advanced imaging with high-definition scopes and screens: we obviously see more. We see with higher resolution and see things we weren't able to see before. Chromoendoscopy uses dye to enhance contrast and detection of dysplasia, and I'm sure you've seen things like this before. You know, you have something that looked inflamed, you control the inflammation. You have something that's a little suspicious with dye spray, it can be much more obvious, which is really helpful. But it turns out that most of the time, and in a lot of studies, even with standard definition scopes, IBD dysplasia is often quite visible. This is the Chicago experience with this 140 and 160 Olympus scopes, 58.5% of dysplastic lesions, 80% of cancers. In the UK, again, with standard different scopes with 2004, 77% of dysplastic lesions were identified, visualized, and noted on an endoscopy report back in 2004. In a retrospective looking at high def versus standard def, and this is over 1,500 endoscopies, you definitely see more lesions with high def. So really, it's not just for football anymore. It really makes a difference in what we see and what we can see in endoscopy. The question becomes, is chromoendoscopy better, and better for what? 8 trials compared standard definition white light compared to standard chromo. None showed a significant increase in per patient detection of dysplasia. A meta-analysis showed an absolute increase of 6%. In 4 tandem studies, chromo detected 1.94-fold more lesions compared to standard definition white light. But the question becomes, do these lesions actually change lives? And that's the part that's not known. And that was the setting in which the SCENIC consensus was issued. And this is the specific recommendation. When performing surveillance with high-definition colonoscopy, chromoendoscopy is suggested rather than white light colonoscopy. 84% agreement of the people present, with a conditional recommendation and low-quality evidence. The data behind this was pretty limited. Their primary study was a tandem study finding dysplasia, 21% of patients with chromo and 9% with high-definition white light. But a similar study in Holland at the same time, a retrospective study where they were early adopting centers with chromo, found dysplasia in 11% of 440 scopes with chromo and 10% in 1,802 scopes with high-definition of white light. And really, in clinical practice in a big center, not seeing a big difference. So the text of the recommendation from SCENIC was, when performing surveillance with high-definition colonoscopy, chromoendoscopy is suggested rather than white light for all patients with extensive colonic IBD. And that was a pretty controversial statement to make. And interestingly, 3 different folks, one of whom was me, independently in 3 different journals, wrote editorials saying that, you know, that's really not where the evidence is, and we really shouldn't be making this a standard of care for everyone. So essentially a big whoa, and that's pretty unusual in the literature to see multiple people when you have a recommendation like that to say, no, we really disagree on that. So why so much disagreement? There are technical issues. Really, is chromo really better than high-definition white light? Their data was largely based on standard definition. And is there effectiveness outside of trials and clinical practice? Then there's the conceptual issues. There is no evidence of effectiveness in reducing invasive cancer or cancer mortality, which was really the point of all this, and no evidence of cost effectiveness. But doesn't chromoendoscopy detect more dysplasia? And I think that's a common problem. Yes, it does. Absolutely. It is more sensitive. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's better for the patient. And essentially, it's the wrong question. The question is, are we preventing invasive cancer? And it's based on a key assumption that all dysplasia inevitably progresses to invasive cancer. And that's essentially what most of us, at least those as old as I, were taught in medical school. But the problem, let me check, with population screening for cancer or even pre-cancer is that we don't necessarily have a lot of success. What we have is a lot of false positives. And in a large RCT, and this is the example from prostate cancer, no change in mortality from PSA screening. And the total spending on unnecessary prostate cancer treatment is estimated at $59 million a year in the US. So the question is, yes, we can screen, yes, we can test people, but are we actually changing lives or just spending a lot more money? And the problem with our teaching about dysplasia is that it's assumed that you start with a cell mutation, advances for hyperplasia, dysplasia, in situ cancer, and then invasive cancer. And that's what we're taught, the Vogelgram. But what we aren't taught is more recent findings that cancers can actually go the other direction. And it is a little bit shocking and not what we were taught, which is basically from research in the 1970s and early 80s, that we have programmed cell death and immunologic surveillance that prevent a lot of precancers from advancing to invasive cancer. We have a lot of defense mechanisms that actually work pretty well. So essentially, there are different kinds of cancer, and I'm going to make the analogy to different animals. Some cancers fly like birds. They're rapidly invasive. No screening will ever catch them. They will appear and get to invasive so fast that screening isn't going to matter. Then there are cancers like rabbits that are fast but not too fast, and that if you screened regularly, you could catch those early before they advance. And that's the goal, is if you can find the rabbits before they advance to invasive cancer, you can really make a difference. There are also many cancers that are slow and indolent that often have no mortality because of competing risk, and prostate cancer is often considered the example. There are a lot of low-grade indolent prostate cancers that get a lot of treatment without a lot of benefit to the patient. And then there is a lot of dysplasia and some invasive cancers that are more like dodos, that are doomed to extinction without any intervention at all. And that's the surprising thing that we were not taught in medical school. So taking the example to mammograms and breast cancer, it's remarkable. The younger women get, the more false positive they get, the more unnecessary biopsies, and the more indolent cancers that are, quote, cured. The relatively few lives saved from mammograms. And so it becomes up, what happens if you change your screening to a more sensitive test? And this is essentially what we've done by going with chromoendoscopy. Japan actually did this experiment on a population level. Pediatric neuroblastoma is very rare, but because a high-level official in Japan had a child with pediatric neuroblastoma, there was a political decision to do population-wide ultrasound screening of all infants for neuroblastoma. The number of neuroblastomas found skyrocketed, and there were lots more brain surgeries on infants, but no change in mortality. Eventually, it got to the point that somebody said, well, wait a minute, why don't we monitor 1 centimeter neuroblastomas or smaller? And what will happen? Are these rabbits that we prevented from becoming really dangerous neuroblastomas, or are these turtles that are really indolent, or just dodos? And it turns out they were all dodos, and all went away with watchful waiting. And so it really shows that, yes, you can be more sensitive, yes, you can find more cancer, but many of them, especially pediatric cancers, will go away on their own. And many advanced dysplasias will go away on their own. So, and you might question, does this really happen that often? And probably the best example is from a breast cancer screening study in Stockholm. 40,000 women were randomized, 20,000 to one regimen, 20,000 to another. One arm got mammograms at 0, 1, 3, and 5 years. They found 435 cancers. The other arm only at 0 and 5 years. They only found 217 cancers. So what happened to the other, quote, 211 cancers? Why are they missing? These were biopsy-proven invasive cancers, not just dysplasia. So did the randomization fail? Not on 40,000 women. Did radiation from the mammograms cause 211 extra cancers within 5 years? No, it's not that fast. Or did 211 biopsy-proven breast cancers actually go away? That's actually what probably happened. This isn't dysplasia, it's actually invasive cancer. And when you do more sensitive surveillance, you find more of these dodos, cancers or advanced dysplasias that were going to go away on their own. And that's a really important insight across multiple screening studies, that the more intense we are about screening, the more sensitive our tools, the more we're going to find cancers that don't matter. So does this apply in the colon, you might ask? And the best study is from CT colography. When they find 6 to 9 millimeter colon polyps, they went back and re-looked at 3 years and asked how many changed in volume by at least 20%. 35% did progress. 38% were stable. Nothing changed. You could have waited 3 years, gone back and taken the polyp out. But 27% regressed and 14% completely disappeared within 3 years. So the majority of early dysplasia in the colon does not progress for 6 to 9 millimeter polyps in 3 years. So the question is even earlier, chromoendoscopy found IBD dysplasia very likely to progress? We don't really know. And finding more dysplasia with a more sensitive test, we assume is always a good thing, but it's not. We were wrong about this in breast cancer, prostate cancer, thyroid cancer, and the evidence I haven't shown you, and neuroblastoma. So the evidence is mounting. We can't overdo it with very sensitive screening. So step back and think about what are our goals? Well, one is, of course, to avoid death from colorectal cancer, and also to avoid invasive colorectal cancer that requires things like chemotherapy and radiation. Okay? Now, on one alternative from your friendly colorectal surgeon is you want to prevent colorectal cancer, you don't need a colon. You don't have a colon, you don't have colon cancer. Colectomy for everyone. That would work, and there are certainly countries where there are very high rates of colectomy for chronic IBD. But the patient goals are different. Patients don't want invasive cancer. But they also don't want a colectomy unless they really need it. They want essentially a just-in-time colectomy. So what does that mean? Ideally, it should happen before invasive, stages 2 to 4 colorectal cancer, because the treatment for stage 1 is still colectomy. So you're going to get some false positive colectomies. So you say, I removed your colon. It turns out you did not have colon cancer. You just had advanced dysplasia. That's essentially the same outcome as for a stage 1. So what's the right rate of false positive colectomies? When we think about appendectomies, it might be as acceptable as high as 30%, but it's a judgment call. But certainly we shouldn't have 100% false positive colectomies, taking a lot of colons that don't have cancer. So ideally, we're going to risk stratify patients. Those who are high risk for colorectal cancer or progression to colorectal cancer, those should go to colectomy. And the low risk, we can continue surveillance. So the idea of risk stratification is because colectomy prevents colon cancer with 100% specificity and a relatively low one-time cost, but it's a big decrement in quality of life for the patient. And that's really why they want that just-in-time colectomy, so they delay that decrease in quality of life until there's high risk of progression. Now, dysplasia, as I've illustrated, is not always the same. Not all dysplasia advances, and the natural history isn't always the same. And some of it is looking back at what we found in the olden days, when we had low definition and random biopsies, and people were taking 10 to 20 biopsies per colon. If dysplasia was found using that approach, there must have been a lot of it. Essentially, it's like hitting the side of a barn. If you found dysplasia with 18 biopsies, there must be a fair amount of dysplasia. So you're finding big fields of dysplasia or multifocal dysplasia. And dysplasia that's found in this way is pretty specific for a high risk of progression and a high risk of synchronous cancer. And the best example is from Tom Ullman's study from 2003. When they discovered dysplasia with 10 to 20 low-definition white light endoscopy, 15% had synchronous colorectal cancer, 53% progressed to high-grade dysplasia or colorectal cancer over 5 years. So essentially a specificity of 68%. In contrast, Jim Marion's paper from Mount Sinai in 2016, they were kind of the leading edge in chromoendoscopy. But of the folks they sent to colectomy for chromoendoscopy found dysplasia, nobody had colorectal cancer. So the sensitivity is great, but the specificity is 0. So your chromoendoscopy has high sensitivity, but you're trading it for lower specificity. So the question becomes, is chromoendoscopy found dysplasia helpful for actually risk stratifying people? The sensitivity is way, way up, but the specificity is down to nearly 0. The result is more false positive colectomies, patients who don't actually have cancer. And you have to ask, is this the result we want? Is it what patients want? And is it really the best way to spend healthcare dollars in IBD? Another strategy that's been proposed is to find dysplasia and cut it out, do surveillance and EMR. Does that have high specificity? The thing is, we don't really know for a given lesion, was it definitely going to lead to invasive colorectal cancer? If it's the kind of thing that's visible without chromo that you would have found in the olden days with 10 to 20 biopsies, that's probably high risk. But we don't know if something you can only see on chromo is highly likely to advance or very unlikely to advance. And there's no evidence yet of clinical benefit to the patient. It's not a low-cost approach, and maybe there's less increment in quality of life, but maybe not if somebody's coming in for chromo annually. The other question in hunting IBD colorectal cancer, or at least IBD dysplasia with chromo, is that it seems like, to some extent, IBD-CRC is decreasing over time, that we've sort of missed the window when it was frequent. What we found is that over time, Tina Jess in Denmark found that the rate of colorectal cancer is about half of what it was back in the 80s. Kappelman found that the standard incidence rate of GI cancers in UC was going down over time into the 2000s, while non-GI cancers were actually stable or rising. And the GARG meta-analysis found a falling risk over time. Some of this is probably because we have better therapies and better control of inflammation, so there's less risk of cancer. And the best predictor of future colorectal cancer is actually histologic inflammation. So the better you treat people for symptom control, as well as endoscopic remission, the less likely you are to see colorectal cancers in the future. So it's less likely that surveillance is making a difference, because this decrease started falling in 1978. And for most patients, surveillance started well after 1978. So it looks like it's more the meds than the surveillance. So what are alternatives to doing chromoendoscopy or intensive surveillance, or combining with surveillance? Chemoprevention is a possibility. This is a paper that showed in the New England Journal a few years back that statins are associated with a decrease in colorectal cancer overall by about half, and strikingly in the IBD subset, very small, mind you, 55 patients, a decrease of 94% in colorectal cancer if they took statins. Now, that's a very small sample of 55 patients, but there is some biologic plausibility to it because statins actually cause apoptosis in colorectal cancer cells. This was scaled up by Ashwin Ananthakrishnan, who looked at 1,370 IBD patients who used statins, compared them to 9,000 plus who did not use statins, and controlled for usual risk factors for colorectal cancer, including surveillance colonoscopy in the last 3 years, and found that statin use was associated with a 58% reduction in IBD-CRC, which is pretty dramatic when we don't have any evidence that chromoendoscopy actually reduces colorectal cancer and IBD. So you have to think about cost and effectiveness. If it's cost effective, you want low annual cost, high benefits, and low risk. 5 ASAs, about $5,000 per year. Estimated benefit, about 43% from one meta-analysis. No risks from the colectomy. Pravastatin, if you're going to pick a generic statin, about $96 a year. Estimated benefit of 58% reduction. Again, relatively low cost. And chromoendoscopy, and taking an example from Mount Sinai, about $8,600 a year. No evidence that it reduces CRC, and a lot of risk and cost from EMRs and potential colectomies that are false positives. So the rate of IBD-CRC is low. It's been falling long before surveillance programs. Early dysplasia often shrinks or goes away. Sensitivity can sacrifice specificity, and our goals are fewer invasive colorectal cancers and fewer colectomies. Not necessarily finding early dysplasia nor resecting it, because there's not yet a proven benefit to the patient. So is the road ahead scenic? I would say right now it's pretty foggy, and we need the defogging of evidence. We need to prove that chromoendoscopy actually reduces invasive colorectal cancer and that the cost and number of colectomies to prevent an invasive colorectal cancer makes sense. And it might make sense in selected high-risk patients who've previously had dysplasia, who have PSC, or have a family history. It really might make sense in those selected patients, but we need to know that. And in terms of CRC prevention, it's possible that maybe we should be putting high-risk patients on statins or other chemopreventive meds, possibly the benefit of 5-ASAs. And you really have to ask, does endoscopic resection actually make sense in terms of cost effectiveness compared to pravastatin at under $100 a year? So we need evidence to prove we're truly helping patients avoid death, colorectal cancer, chemo, radiation, and we're not just hunting dodos. So now I'm going to turn to the second half of my talk, a different topic entirely, and talking about AI and GI. And this is an area I've been working on for a while, and some of my colleagues have been doing this a lot in IBD. So what is artificial intelligence, and how is it going to affect you in your practice? Well, AI allows unsupervised computer algorithms to do very specific tasks that previously required a human brain. And there are a lot of related terms. You may hear things like machine learning, deep learning, neural networks, random forests, convolutional neural networks, and automated feature extraction or transfer learning. These are all related to forms of artificial intelligence, and they can identify things in ways that humans are capable of. And the typical input data are things like image recognition. And cases that I've seen examples of and are moving from research tools to actual practice are things like Barrett's esophagus and finding dysplasia, finding a gastric cancer, finding pancreatic cancer on a CT scan, other forms of text recognition, natural language processing, and pulling data out of the medical record. And usually the kinds of problems you're talking about are things like classification, is this cancer or not? Assessment, is this quiescent, mild, moderate, or severe, as in IBD? Or prognosis, if for a given image, how probable is a bad outcome, like colectomy? So in terms of image recognition, we do it all the time. We recognize faces. Human babies can recognize their mother's face within 2 weeks of birth. We do it all the time. We don't think about it, but think about how would you teach a computer to recognize faces? Obviously, cameras can do it. As you can see in an example on the left, it's recognizing faces and helping you pick the best level, depth of focus. But when you actually try to do it, there are edge cases, types of cases that are actually pretty darn hard. So I'm going to show you some example. This is a collection of images that a computer algorithm can have a hard time with. Differentiating a chihuahua from a blueberry muffin, which you don't think about it. You can do it, but this is a case where you have to think about it a little bit. Another one is fried chicken versus labradoodle. This is a very texture-based thing. This is the kind of thing that confuses artificial intelligence and computers. And we're getting better at it, but it's amazing how many edge cases give computers problems. And this is a big issue when you're trying to identify a polyp or a pancreatic cancer. So how does the human brain do this? There are layers of neurons in the visual cortex, and I'm going to summarize about 25 years of work in neuroanatomy in about 5 seconds. They take input from the right and left retina. They use lateral comparisons from adjacent neurons to detect edges. And edges feed into the recognition of shapes, like going from circles to a pupil within the eye. And shapes feed into recognition of more complex objects. And it just goes higher levels of layers of neurons that we put this information together. And neural networks are designed to do essentially the same task. Data are fed into nodes and then nodes into layers. And typically the data come to a neural network as things like pixels or red, green, and blue channels from your endoscope. And these are fed in, given assigned weights, detect edges, detect features, and each layer feeds into a more complex agglomeration of information and recognition of objects. For years, these are good at classification, but they're not good at identifying what the key features are. And for years, you needed experts to tell you which features were important, and it's often difficult. A lot of times, your expert will say, I just know dysplasia when I see it. You know, it's the Kudo pit pattern. I can look at it and I just know. And we often had to hand code algorithms to detect these features and then feed them into a classifier algorithm. A new technique called convolution allows automated feature extraction from images. And you can find important features that experts might not have known about. And they can feed into a classifier, and this is what's called convolutional neural nets, which are kind of a hot area right now, which basically speed up the process dramatically. So here's an example of a deep learning neural network. You take a picture of a random president. You identify from pixels on the left at the bottom the light and dark pixel values. These are put into a new layer that basically focuses on identifying edges. These go into the next layer to identify combinations of edges and shapes. The next layer identifies features like noses, eyes, mouth, chin, and those are all put together to identify combination and select which president this is. In this case, it identifies George Washington. And this is essentially the process that most of the deep learning is using. There are a little bit fancier versions. You can often start with a previously trained model and do transfer learning and then add the specific of your model to it. So if you have a trained model for some other aspect of endoscopy, you can dramatically accelerate a new model using transfer learning. And when it works, you can use object detection with high probability. And these are examples where they're telling you the probability of identifying a cat, dog, person, horse, dog. One problem with this, though, if you look very closely on the left, you'll see what's identified as a car with very high probability is actually a pickup truck. And the problem there isn't necessarily that the algorithm is bad, but that the person or persons putting together the training set didn't differentiate between a pickup truck and a car. Now, if that doesn't matter, that's fine. But if it does matter that that's actually a pickup truck, that's a problem. So the quality of your input data and how it's classified makes a big difference. So why is AI and deep learning taking off now? I think there are two trends. One, we have a much more available labeled digital data. Enormous classified and labeled data sets are required. So you can't just have a million colonoscopies. They have to be specifically labeled for the ones that have polyps and which frames have polyps. And there's much more digital data, including digital video, available now. We also have a lot more computing power, for which we largely have to thank our young video game playing friends. Because this is mainly due to new high-performance graphics processing units, or GPUs, that have a parallel architecture that allow them to draw the monster and the warrior on the screen at the same time, but it's very efficient for deep learning, extracting multiple features at the same time. And clusters with many GPUs reduce model training time from weeks to hours or less. So let me talk a little bit next about sensitivity and specificity, because there's what the statisticians do and then what we have to decide as clinicians. So the models produce probabilities, not answers. And we have to choose the cut points to classify predicted outcomes. And these cut points should reflect medical goals, not statistical ones. And it really depends on the downstream implications. I'm going to give you two examples. Esophageal biopsy looking for dysplasia in Barrett's esophagus, and pancreatic cancer based on CT scans. Is there cancer present? And selecting the cut points really matters because the outcomes are so different. If you're screening for esophageal cancer, and if your AI says that spot looks positive, take an extra biopsy, the risk is pretty low. You might get a false positive, a negative biopsy, so it's worth it to choose a very high sensitivity so you don't miss any esophageal cancer, because the harms of a false positive are very low. In contrast, if you diagnose a pancreatic cancer with an AI model based on a CT scan, that person is going to get a Whipple. And that is, if it's a false positive, that's a really bad thing. So you're going to choose high specificity, a high positive predictive value, and you're going to tweak your cut point. And I think it's really important as we develop these that we understand the performance, both in negative predictive value and positive predictive value, and decide if that makes sense clinically. It's also important that a lot of these models work in the ivory tower, work in a very defined data set, but if you take them out in the world and you see what are called edge cases or very different examples, they fail, and sometimes fail dramatically. Volvo really famously developed a model to detect animals. So if you have an elk crossing the road, or a moose, or a reindeer, or a cat, or a dog, some kind of quadruped moving across the road, your car slows down and stops so you don't hit the animal. Apparently, a lot of Volvos get damaged hitting elk. So they thought they had the greatest thing going, and then they tested it in Australia. And there's one problem. A lot of animals crossing the road in Australia don't have 4 legs and don't walk. And the model ignored them. So you would be driving your autonomous Volvo in Australia, and it wouldn't go well for the kangaroos. So edge cases, different cases, the rare cases are really a problem. And probably the most famous example in the US is this Tesla that took on a white semi. Apparently, and because this happened again in March of 2019, their AI thinks this is either an overpass or a very large sign if it's perfectly perpendicular and white and rectangular. That is a very specific weakness of the Tesla AI. So there are also edge cases in medicine. This is not a rare thing. A classic example in IBD is genetic risk models. We know that NOD2 variants predict complicated Crohn's disease. TPMT variants predict slow processing of therapeurines. But both models were developed in Europeans and European Americans. When applying these models in Asia, they completely fail. They are utterly worthless. It turns out they simply have a different genetic background. If you think about these as edge cases, 59% of the world's population, these models do not work. So you need diversity in your data set to make your models generalizable. So you also have to ask, once you have a model, what's really driving it? Not that anyone in the room has done this, but if you trained a model on a data set of histopathology slides to detect dysplasia and ulcerative colitis and got a model that was 100% accurate, you think, this is amazing, this is the greatest thing ever. And then you ask, what's the most important feature? And it turns out that your pathologists like to mark the interesting parts of slides with green ink dots. And so the most important feature is the presence of a green ink dot on your slide. That's a trivial feature. But this has been found in other forms of modeling. For example, a large model looking at pneumonia in chest x-rays. Top predictors include the presence of a central line, the presence of a nasogastric tube, a lower resolution or a portable, or literally the word portable on the film. So inpatients, of course, are more likely to have pneumonia, and models use all of the information provided, even if it's trivial. So you really have to know how your model works, and is it accurate, generalizable, and meaningful. So what makes a good model? First place is, of course, lots and lots of data and diverse data, and it's not overfitted to one particular data set. Our rule of thumb for doing logistic regression is you should have at least 10 cases per predictor, and for a rare thing like cancer, that can be a problem, and our convolutional neural networks have thousands of nodes. We often split the data into train and test, so there's an independent validation sample. It's good if that testing set is large. It's even better if it's an independent multi-center data set that's very diverse to make that more generalizable. And you want to make sure that the testing set is representative of real-world practice and certainly of the patients in your practice. It's important to know how your model works and make sure the features make sense and at least correlate with something important that makes biologically plausible reasons. There are recently a lot of new explainers to try to understand why a classifier that is sort of a black box actually classified individual cases. This is an example from breast cancer biopsies. The green are the features that favor benign, and the red are the features that favor malignant. And you can see for any given case what the features are, whether it was bare nuclei or large nuclei, whatever the features were, what helped make that model make that decision. And that's become a legal issue in Europe, both generally in Europe with the GDPR and specifically in France. If you're using a model to make either financial or health decisions, you have to be able to explain that to the user or to the patient or person affected. And that is part of law in Europe, and that's really made a big difference in being able to explain models, particularly in healthcare. There are additional challenges in endoscopy. Models that work on still images don't necessarily work on video images. There are a lot of frames that will be blurry or unfocused. Some will be, of course, obscured by stool in a colonoscopy. And you need nearly real-time image recognition, which requires fast computing and timely and useful feedback to the endoscopist. But this is coming very quickly. This is a very early example of using fluorescent colors to identify this is a polyp, don't miss it. These aren't perfect, and they're certainly a little ways from clinical application, but there's a lot of competition in this space, and it's not that far off before you'll start seeing vendors trying to sell you products that do something like this, and you have to understand where this comes from and where the weaknesses are. So AI in GI, and particularly in endoscopy, is coming fast. Big digital data and GPU technology have converged to kind of make this faster and easier. Data sets need to be diverse and model generalizability tested and be sure it's relevant to your patients and your setting. The edge cases need to be identified and incorporated into the models. You don't want your patient to be the kangaroo. You need multiple large independent testing and validation sets, and the models need to be explained. You need to know how the model works and why. To identify and avoid trivial features in your predictive model, but also for legal reasons in Europe. And we're going to be seeing more of that as they're going to have to explain why this works and that it's not truly a black box. Thank you.